The room was too bright for a grievance. Fluorescent tubes buzzed overhead in the community hall on Eldridge and 6th. The kind usually rented for chess clubs and baby showers. Tonight, a folding table had been dressed up as a dais, and my father's name, misspelled in vinyl letters, sagged across a banner that said Neighborhood Mediation Night. People packed into rows of plastic chairs, neighbors, a few reporters. 2 board members from the community fund my father used to auto-tan the smell of instant. Coffee drifted from the back where a harried volunteer pumped a dented urn. Fareed stood near the front with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, and the microphone cable curled under his shoe like a patient snake. I kept my coat on, though. The room was warm, fingers in the pocket around a stiff cream envelope I'd promised myself not to open yet. In the next minutes, you'll see how a person with no raised voice and a well-labeled folder can move a room. Dismantle a lie and vacate a judgment that tried to erase blood. A boy fiddled with the dimmer and bathed us in a flatter glow. My father used to say, light behaves like permission. Give it too much and it invites him. My father wasn't here. He was the reason this hall was filled. And he was the reason I'd been excluded from the courtroom invitation 2 weeks earlier. The hearing where Fareed had stood up straight and told the judge Kay was the only close relative willing to act in the best interests. The missed invitation was why a judgment had slid through ex parte, granting Fareed a quiet, efficient authority over what was left: the condo, the accounts, the community fund paperwork with my father's neat initials, reputation, inheritance, and the last intact piece of my father's work. That's what they were trying to lift like a watch from a public wrist. A woman in an ironed cardigan was opening the event, reading from something that had too many adverbs. "We are here for truth, accountability," she said, the microphone making a bubble of her breath. I caught my reflection in the dark paneling, a tidy woman with a spiral notebook and a closed mouth, and watched Fareed rest a proprietary hand on the back of a chair, as if testing whether it would hold his weight. The air from the heating vents was dry as an argument no one asked to be part of. Someone at the back coughed into a sleeve. I was here to show that what was filed could be unfiled, and what was excluded could be summoned back into the official light. He saw me, and his smile faltered. He wore a navy blazer bought for mornings just like this, and under it a shirt too white for humility. He touched his tie, then let the hand fall. On the folding table next to him was a plastic binder with a tab that said Judgment Final. I wondered if he'd put the word there for himself, to feel it like a stamp. I kept my eyes on his and thought of the paper that had landed in my mailbox the day after the hearing. The one that had told me in a tone of indifferent pity that a judgment had been entered and letters of administration awarded to the nearest available kin. In the corner of that notice, in faint print, was the clerk's routing code and a time stamp that would end up being more important than it. Looked, 10:17 a.m. A time my father would have liked for its prime factors. 100 eyes made a wait. A man I didn't know, wearing a volunteer badge and the confidence of someone with a clipboard, raised a hand for quiet. "We'll start with brief statements," he said. "Then we'll allow responses." He explained the rules, the time limits, the ban on yelling. Behind him, the cinder block wall wore a mural of handprints in primary colors. It was clearly a room for children's parties. It was also perfect, public, ordinary, a place where paperwork would land with a surprising sound. I slid the envelope deeper into my pocket and kept my hands steady. The envelope's flap was sealed with a small letter V embossed into wax. It had come to me by courier at noon with a minimal note, "Per your request," and the name on the sender's label had been only a capital V in my phone for 2 months. People forget that most rooms don't need an explosion. They need a hinge. 2 hinges, ideally. I had brought both. Apparently, I don't count as family. The sentence climbed up my throat, and I caught it before it reached air. It was for later, not for the first beat. I eased my breath back into order, felt the scuffed floor through my boots, and made myself a promise: I won't shout. I'll use process and receipts. Fareed went first, as planned. He had asked for that courtesy, citing age and grief, though the grief he deployed had a theater sheen. He thanked the organizers for providing a gracious forum, cleared his throat and began to talk about duty. He talked about difficult decisions, about being put in the impossible position of protector. He referred to my father's condo as the apartment, distanced it from a home, and called the bank account a holding pen for liabilities, which made two people in the second row exchange looks. He used the phrase "in the interests of all stakeholders," which meant he'd practiced this in front of a mirror. When he got to the courtroom piece, he couched it in passive grammar. A notice went out. I don't know it reached. I cannot say. He made a small gesture of sorrow. The microphone softened his consonants. I let his words pass over me like rain baked off a windshield. I've heard men like him before. Placed them on panels, escorted them to compliance briefings. Watched them use the longest possible nouns to build scaffolds around a simple act. At work, I manage operations for a nonprofit that audits small neighborhood funds. The job looks like emails. It is actually fingerprints and clocks. When Fareed said the words, "vacate" is not a word to be thrown around lightly. I looked down and counted the staples along the edge of my folder. There were 7. He finished and set the microphone down carefully, like a borrowed thing. The hall hummed. Whispers, a zipper. Chair legs inching. The volunteer with the clipboard nodded to me. I stood smooth and walked the distance to the folding table. I did not touch the microphone. I set my spiral notebook down and rested 2 fingers on its cardboard cover. I looked at the banner with my father's misspelled name, and then at the freestanding coat rack in the corner where a single umbrella dripped onto a paper towel someone had placed under it. You can map a room in a minute if you learn to love the small indignities of it. I said my name first and last. I said my father's name the way he pronounced it himself. Then I said 2 weeks ago. A hearing was held at which a judgment was entered granting letters of administration to my father's brother, based partly on the representation that no other close relative had been contacted or was available. I live 9 subway stops from that courthouse. A pause. The sound of the heater louder now. I did not receive a notice. That judgment rests on an omission. Today I'm going to show you it can be vacated and why it must. It wasn't a speech. Not really. It was an itinerary. I turned my notebook so the binding was on top and flipped it open to reveal not words, but a grid of little sticky tabs, each labeled in block letters. Notice. Service assets. Conflict. Timestamps. Authority. People like to be led with labeled doors. I didn't need to push them all tonight. I built a corridor where each door opened onto the next. The first open loop was a phrase Fareed had used in the clerk's office. Nearest available kin. I set down on the table a photocopy of the judgment with the clerk's file stamp. The word "available" did work here that it had no right to do. I said, "Here is the first receipt." I pulled from my folder a letter addressed to me from the court, the one that arrived a day after the hearing. In the top right corner, the date was clear. The day before. Underneath a tiny string of letters and numbers, the routing code and the time stamp. 10/17. The court's case management software logs outgoing notices with a time mark, Kai said, tapping it. The clerk who ran this print job sent my notice at 10:17 a.m. The hearing docket was called at 9:45 a.m. I asked the records supervisor to print the activity log for that morning. I lifted the certified log sheet, the one Mrs. Delaney had initialed in fountain pen blue. You'll see that my notice was processed after the hearing began. No one clapped. People don't clap for a timestamp. They lean forward. The community fund board member in the front row adjusted his glasses. The volunteer with the clipboard wrote something. Fareed picked at a hangnail. The room's air felt like dry paper. You could have struck a match on it. I explained how the invitation was supposed to be served by mail and email because I had filed a simple request in advance. An address of record. I showed the printout of my submission receipt, redacted to protect other details. With a server confirmation ID that ended in 44F, I slid it across the table to the volunteer, so he could look at the trailing numbers. He passed it to the woman in the cardigan. She touched the page lightly, as if trying to judge its temperature. I told the room how, when the notice didn't arrive. I checked the docket, saw the judgment. and sent a written request for the clerk's log along with a questionnaire about service irregularities. It isn't glamorous, none of this is, but it accumulates like snow. Every third paragraph of a life needs a small sensation to lodge in the body. When I looked up from the paperwork, the light flickered and steadied. And in that half second, you could hear the faint click of the starter as if the ceiling itself had decided to reopen its file. In a cleared voice, I described the apartment. Not the furniture, but the ledger. The condo title had my father's name and one more. This was where Farid's case sucked wind. My father and I co-owned. I said. I let the sentence sit. It was a joint tenancy with right of survivorship. I didn't flourish the phrase. I set it down like a card. Behind me, a man near the door whistled softly. The woman in the cardigan blinked at her notes, realizing they were no longer current. My father filed that deed 2 years ago, I said. He told me to file it, actually. We had been reorganizing the paperwork because he had taken on more community. Audits and didn't want me to be locked out of decisions if something happened. I lifted a certified copy of the deed, the recorder's seal bright in the flat light. The page thick enough to make it sound distinct when I set it down. Recorded, time-stamped, witnessed, and countersigned. I had gotten it 2 days ago after standing at the recorder's window with a patient man who liked stamps. I felt Farid's stare like a periodic draft. He looked down at his binder as if the tab might suddenly produce a solution. If you're going to claim an apartment as an estate asset, I continued quietly, you should check the chain of title. I didn't look at him when I said it. I didn't need to. I started my career in ops. I have learned that an accurate logbook is a more effective blade than any voice that can broadcast across a hall. I kept going. I moved to the bank. I didn't even need to say the bank's name. I used the phrase primary account and watched people replace the proper noun in their heads with whichever institution had most irritated them that year. On the morning of the hearing, a transfer was initiated from that account, I said. The memo line read post-funeral settlements. I have the freeze order I obtained that afternoon and the reversal confirmation. 2 papers, one atop the other, the freeze code from the bank manager. The reversal email with timestamps. 1542 and 1609. I'd known Simon for years from my work audits. He knows the sound of the word improper. When he read the memo line, he didn't ask me to raise my voice. He asked me for the wire ID, I gave it to him, then asked him to certify his own actions in a short letter. The letter had arrived by courier, official letterhead heavy, with a phrase I had suggested reversed and rescinded. There were other receipts, a recording from a call with the funeral home director in which he mentioned that a man claiming to be the sole next of kin had tried to redirect the invoice. A screenshot of a message Farid had sent to our aunt overseas using a rehearsed script line that I knew, because he had used it on me 5 years earlier during a smaller family skirmish. Let me be the bad guy so you can be the good one. I had that line preserved in an old text thread, backed up and time-stamped. When I put the 2 screenshots down together, one 5 years old, one from last week, the repetition glowed like a watermark. A stillness beat. I watched condensation creep down the side of a water pitcher on the table. A thin drop gathering courage and then deciding to move, leaving behind a clear track. Farid shifted his weight and the microphone crackled. I planted my next loop. A contact in my phone saved only as V. I didn't say the name yet. I said only that I had consulted an expert about the community fund audits, an expert whose initials would matter. I mentioned a chain of custody record for footage from the lobby camera in my father's building, showing Farid leaving the apartment with a palmed envelope the night before the hearing. I didn't play the clip. I held up the certified photo still. The camera's angle had caught the envelope's peculiar wax. I didn't open the envelope in my pocket. You don't spend hinges early. People were almost too quiet, the way they get when the story they walked in with has to find a seat at the back. When the volunteer opened the floor to questions, a hand rose from the second row. A woman with a small gold wedding band and a posture that said she works in rules. "What are you asking for?" she said. Practical, impatient for the crux. I filed a motion to vacate the judgment, I said. On grounds of defective service and material omission specifically, the joint tenancy and my address of record. I've also filed a motion to stay any transfers pending a hearing on the motion to vacate. The bank funds have been frozen, reversed, and the condo cannot be treated as part of the estate. I said those words without heat. The verbs were enough. Filed, frozen, reversed, stayed. Fareed spoke then, finally dropping the lacquer. "You're doing this for money," he said into the microphone. His voice had found an edge. "You were never around. Your father trusted me to handle the hard things." A laugh rose uninvited, small as a cough, from the back. The neighbor with the retired cop posture crossed his arms and let his eyes travel to the banner and back to Fareed's face. I felt the edge of my envelope against my palm and let my fingers leave it. "He trusted spreadsheets in daylight," I said. "He trusted signatures that match." I did not shout. I watched the room resize itself, the way people sat slightly straighter, as if a line on a map had been redrawn and their building was now in a different district. I asked the volunteer if I could call on the 3 people I had asked to attend. He nodded. Leah stepped forward, first my father's friend's daughter, a lawyer with posture that turns rooms into courtrooms. She wore no jewelry except a watch that glinted when she turned her wrist to look at her notes. "I reviewed Ms. Qureshi's motion," she said. "It meets the standard for vacateur. Service failed. Material facts were omitted. A hearing will be set." She said the words like stamps: certified, witnessed, recorded. People believe what sounds like a ledger. Next, Simon, the bank manager, quiet as a man who hates microphones. He read from his letter, the date, the time, the wire ID, the reversal. "Funds frozen," he said, pending further instruction by the court. He flicked his eyes toward me, and I nodded once. We had met once at a neighborhood cleanup. Paper clips and rubber gloves can be on the same team. Third, Mrs. Delaney from Records, gray hair pinned with practical precision, reading glasses on a chain. She explained the routing code and the timing. She was not dramatic. She was precise. The notice left the queue after the hearing commenced. She said as if she were reading a weather report. Several heads bowed to scribble. I could feel the heater's breath on my shins. The light over the dais hummed, a sound like a rule being complied with. The plastic chairs squeaked as people shifted, and somewhere a phone vibrated apologetically against a purse lining. The room had turned less to me than to the idea that process had choreography and someone had bothered to learn the steps. I allowed a pause and then opened the hinge I had kept shut. I took from my pocket the cream envelope, unbroken wax, with the V. I set it on the table. "This arrived today," I said. "It contains a copy of a trust my father executed last year. It was held in escrow pending a trigger he defined. That trigger occurred when the judgment was entered ex parte without me present." I slid a thumbnail under the wax, lifted the flap, and drew out the document. "The trust appoints me as successor trustee for his community audit files and the funds associated with that work, specifically to ensure that audits in progress are completed and that anyone attempting to interfere can be enjoined." Fareed's mouth opened and closed. It is hard to find sentences when a door shuts that you use to enter rooms with. I turned to the board members in the front row. "You knew my father for 2 decades, I said. "He recorded every receipt. He would not leave his audits vulnerable to a person who calls an account a holding pen for liabilities." I turned pages with a soft whisper, found the clause. "Clause 7, subsection C," I said. "Power to request, receive, and certify audit records. Authority to freeze and reverse disbursements inconsistent with established controls. Standing to petition for injunctive relief." The verbs lined up neatly. Soldiers at inspection. I lifted a second page, not from the envelope, but from my folder. The chain of custody for the lobby camera footage. "To the extent anyone is uncertain whether my father's files were handled appropriately," I said, "we can review the tape of an envelope leaving his apartment at 10:42 p.m. the night before the hearing with someone other than him. That envelope was returned today by courier, in this." I tapped the wax seal without looking at Fareed. "Whoever retrieved it last night returned it this morning after receiving notice that an audit trail had been initiated." This was the twist. But I did not play it like a magician. I let it stand, and then I named Vic, a digital forensics analyst who had helped me reconstruct the file access timeline in the shared folder my father kept for his audits fee in my phone. Because 2 months ago I did not want to tell anyone I was calling a favor in. Vic had provided an affidavit with log extracts showing access from Farid's home Wi-Fi during a time he'd publicly claimed to be at the hospital. I read the relevant lines, time-stamped IP recorded. I did not draw arrows. People can see lines when they are underlined with numbers. The room exhaled as one. A chair leg knocked the sticky floor a cluck like a metronome. Farid tried to speak, and the microphone made a sharp feedback whine, as if the room itself objected. He flinched and stepped back. He reached for his binder and then didn't. I kept the last hinge for mercy. I said, "I'm not here to arrest anyone in a hall. I'm here to put the right thing back into the official record. The motion to vacate will be heard next week. In the meantime, I've drafted a stipulation we can all sign tonight before witnesses agreeing not to transfer, conceal, or destroy any documents or funds related to my father's estate or his audit work." I lifted a single page with lines for signatures. "It will be filed, time-stamped, and recorded in the morning." The room moved like a school of fish, a collective shift toward a path that had suddenly appeared. Leah stepped forward with a pen. Simon stepped closer, as if to lend his plain presence as ink. Mrs. Delaney, bless her, found her readers and approached with the deliberation of someone about to notarize a reality. The volunteer produced a date stamp from a plastic box, the kind you get at office supply stores when your budget is honest. People love to watch a thing become official in front of their eyes. It is the civic version of a magic trick, except the rabbit is mutual trust. Farid's face arranged itself into options and then abandoned them. "This is performative," he said. This is a spectacle." His voice pitched up and then down, looking for a floor. "Apparently, I don't count as family." I said it out loud then, my mouth finding the sentence like a familiar path. I said it without pity, only as a citation quoting the condition the judgment had asserted. The room heard how the words sounded here versus in a clerk's office, how they diminished in public air. But I do count as an owner. And as the person my father trusted to finish his work, I signed the stipulation first, my name steady. Leah signed as witness. Simon added his signature as a custodian of practical facts. Mrs. Delaney stamped the date and noted the time in her neat, slanted handwriting. The board members signed. Farid did not. He held himself as if he had stepped into a photograph and didn't want to move in case the camera caught him worse. Then he took the pen and signed small. His name angled slightly upward like a man who hopes a line will carry him out of gravity's jurisdiction. He put the pen down too hard. It clacked. The light over us hit a quiet. The heater sighed off. For a second, the hall was so still, you could hear the thin squeak of the wax seal tearing when I slid the envelope's flap all the way open to retrieve the trust's last page. The smell in the room had shifted. Less coffee, more paper. I thought of my father in his chair, leg crossed at the ankle, pencil behind his ear, saying, "If a thing is fair, it can be slow." He had taught me how to reverse a series, not with algebra, but with a ledger and a steady hand. After the signatures, people stood slower, as if careful not to tip over a new arrangement. Leah hugged me, brief and professional. Simon shook my hand with the gravity of a man who knows the weight of a freeze code. Mrs. Delaney patted my arm and murmured, "Bring the stipulation by at 9. I'll see that it's scanned and recorded before noon." The board members thanked me and said they'd send a note to their donors in the morning, that audit protocols would be tightened, that my father's last reports would be published with an introduction that spelled his name correctly. Outside, the night had that New York winter smell of old stone and metal railings. The air cut clean through the leftover heat the hall had pressed into my clothes. Nate, my downstairs neighbor, a tired cop, habitual realist, was waiting by the curb with a takeout coffee he'd walked 3 blocks to get, because the hall's urn was an affront to dignity. He handed it to me and didn't say proud. He said, "You did it with receipts," which is how we say proud in this city. We stood there, the steam stitching into the streetlight's cone, and watched Farid come out. He did not look over. He kept his binder tight against his ribs, like he could warm himself on the word final he'd typed on the tab. He turned left and was gone. I slept for 4 hours, then woke and nudged the stipulation into a fresh envelope. The morning had that hard blue light that makes people do their taxes. I took the subway to the courthouse with a folder under my arm that felt heavier than paper. At 9 sharp, Mrs. Delaney waved me past a small line, took the envelope, and led me to the scanner herself. The machine clicked and hummed, its little screen marching through a progress bar. She stamped the received date in blue and logged the entry. Fingers moving with a rhythm that made the moment ordinary, which is how you know a thing will last. "There," she said, and I thanked her with the sincerity I reserve for people who work in records. The stipulation was recorded, time-stamped, scanned into the docket part of the file now, not merely a breath in a hall. In the days that followed, the Ripples decided where they wanted to go. The board sent its letter to donors, and I saw the reply supportive. Few shocked at the attempt to reach into files my father had sworn to protect. A small foundation postponed a grant until the audit protocol updates were in place. Then they doubled it. An intern in the community fund office brought me a shoebox my father had labeled with his old block script. To be opened by MQ, containing a fountain pen and a stack of clean index cards that smelled faintly like the soap he kept by the sink. I took the pen in my hand and felt its weight settle into the space between thumb and forefinger as if it had been measured for me. At the hearing on the motion to vacate, the judge asked precise questions, the kind that feel like someone lining up paper corners. Leah rose and answered. We filed exhibits, numbered and tabbed. We cited rules and cases. I didn't look at Farid. I watched the clerk's hands as she took the pages and smoothed them before slide stamping each with the court's seal. The judge granted the motion. The judgment was vacated. We set a schedule for proper notice. I walked out of that courtroom, the air cooler than the hall had been, and stood on the steps in a light that made the marble look like it had a conscience. Reporters called. I answered none. I sent a short statement by email. The court granted our motion. We're proceeding with care and compliance. The story other people wanted betrayal with a soundtrack was not the story I had. The story I had was a chain of verbs that knew their jobs: filed, served, recorded, frozen, audited, certified, witnessed, countersigned, escalated, cited, complied. You can build a life on those words. You can build a quiet house. When I got home that night, the apartment had that warm bread smell of a place that's been empty in a decent way. I made tea and set the pen and the index cards on the table. I took out the envelope with the V seal, now broken, and slid the trust back into its sleeve. I texted Vic a thank you that was longer than most men deserve. And he sent back a thumbs up and a picture of his dog wearing a bandana printed with binary jokes. Nate sent a photo of the community hall banner. My father's name amended with a small, careful pen stroke through the extra letter. We are a neighborhood of small corrections. That's how you keep a city honest. A week later, Farid called and asked to meet in a place without microphones. We sat in a diner with chrome edges and a waitress who knew when to top off and when to leave people to their paper placemats. He opened with a story about pressure. He said words like legacy and expectations, words that try to buy sympathy with credit. I watched the steam from his coffee unravel and let him talk long enough to show me where he had changed and where he hadn't. When he ran out, I put 3 papers on the table: the vacater order, the stipulation we'd signed, and a letter I drafted spelling out access terms to my father's files for anyone with legitimate standing. I'm not looking to go to war with you, I said. I'm looking to codify boundaries. I pointed to the paragraph about the key card. His building access would be removed from the shared archive room at the fund by Friday. If he needed to see something, he'd email a request and we'd schedule a supervised review. He read it and nodded. A man who knows lines when they appear in ink. He asked for a copy. I slid one over. He took it between 2 fingers like a truce and not a loss. We left without shaking hands. That's fine. Some things you don't bless with gestures. You bless them with compliance. The board adopted the updated audit policy. We published my father's unfinished reports, finished now with a short note at the top that read, like him, "Errors are mine. Corrections belong to everyone." Donors wrote back with gratitude. A neighborhood school used one of the audit templates to clean up their cafeteria vendor billing and found enough savings to fix the ovens. It is not a parade. It is a ledger. But sometimes ledgers buy ovens. A month later, on a colder night, I found the envelope opener my father used to keep by the bookshelf, small brass thing shaped like a leaf. I slid it into the cream envelope with a V and sliced it clean, though it was already open. I did it for the small ceremony of it, the tactile win. The brass was cool. The paper gave with a satisfying whisper. I wrote my father's corrected name on an index card and pinned it under a magnet on the fridge. A place of dailiness and late-night decisions. I stood there with the door closed, hand on the handle, and breathed on the metal until a faint halo of fog appeared and disappeared. The most human stamp there is. The sentence they tried to staple to me has been unfastened. On some nights when I pass the community hall, I look through the window at the empty chairs and hear the heater's patient breath and the hum of the light, and the soft civic music of stamps. My father would have liked that the climax of our story wasn't a shout, but a set of papers. Sliding across a plastic table under cheap fluorescent tubes, he would have liked the line that organized the room that night, the one that broke and refit the geometry of attention. I say it sometimes alone in the quiet kitchen. Not as accusation anymore, but as a badge that I took away from the clerk's misprint and wore until it became heavy enough to turn into something else. Apparently, I don't count as family. If this story helped you breathe steadier through your own storm, share it with someone who needs a calm blueprint. When you're ready to act, start with one receipt, one stamp, and one person who respects a timestamp.